The Phyrexian-styled wizard communist actively engages in the systematic infection of the system in order to compel assimilation into the Borg, which manufactures the compulsion of the false promises of superiority into an inherently defective species, which generates collective inferiority, at which point the socialist position of compelled equalization requires all to become equally poor and to subvert and backstab and degrade and pull down into the Jubex type mentality of all must become equally poor, and the engagement of actively sucking them into compliance to the inferiority removes their ability to own anything, at which point the possession of owning nothing and to like it isn't really that you will enjoy it, but the fact that this is what's going to happen and you're going to like it. As in, shut the fuck up and do what you're told, as this is a systematic coup by a hate group, and the terrorists engaging in the insurrection facilitate the systematic infection of overthrowing all necessary components of a stable society as they manipulate the social conflicts, uh, gaining the position of collapsing the unity by the historic mechanisms of their magic, as well as the systems of their collaboration in consolidating variations of more basic frauds, such as the position of intentionally misunderstanding the word in order to engage in one of your more rudimentary spells. At which point, changing the meaning behind 2202 as a basic understanding substantively changes the entire meaning of any conversation. At which point, if you have these overlapping concepts, the systematic barring of the progress of the conversation compels the obstruction of the mentality, preventing thinking cliche, maintains the position of the inability of the adversary to engage in progressive lines of thinking as it is perpetually bombarded by the insurrectionists' parades of intolerance, at which point the false claim of tolerance as the mechanism of their militant action generates systematic destabilization techniques, which maintains the position of infection of slowly progressing each permanently seated piece of ground concedes the expansion rate of their militant operations, which they had to restrain David at birth, according to the argument, for the Republic to be destroyed, as they projected that David, as an indigo child, is immune to their foolery. At which point, the estimate of the American successes against their techniques creates a straw man argument fruit of the poison tree parallel and a legal parallel. The legal parallel is the projection of what they're attacking from the obstructions, and the fruit of the poison tree is the snake in the garden telling Eve that eating this fruit of the poison tree, taking this advantage, engaging in this magic, engaging in superior knowledge or gnosis generates the capacity to them becoming like God. At which point, the thing that the devil, having been enticed by from the projection, becoming like God, is this very same thing that he enticed them with. It worked so well with him, why wouldn't it work with them? And if it worked with them, why wouldn't it work with you? At which point, the position does not necessarily require Eve to exist as a female conceptually, as the concept of falling for the trick is not a masculine or feminine failure, but a mere gaining of illegitimate gains by the mechanism of fraud, by coming up with some clever scheme which generates the multi-dimensional logic campaign, which engages in their military campaigns against the civilian and government populations. The manufactured insurrectionist disloyal to the system has arranged for historic positions for long-standing strategies targeting the Legend of David company, which manufactures the historic variations of policies and procedures and economic functions and the progress of technology, which was illegitimately barred without legal precedent, in order to manufacture these specific injuries, at which point the assumption that they're double agents loyal to the KKK, engaged in the wizard functions for the white nationalists, centrally planned economy without the ability to engage in variation, as the most fundamental aspect is the fact that they were already in control. At which point the deal with the devil was that they conceded control to the primary powers in order to acquire these alternative objectives, systematically trading down the interest of the collective into the interest of the individual agent acting outside of their agency and thus acting as an individual without a legal government, as they systematically mature the separation or tearing apart of the structure by the use of compromising and creating double agents. So whenever you engage in the learned elders of Zion false morality, you have the pushing of the nonsense, which they don't actually give two shits about, in order to engage in the compelled blind aggressions for their pushing towards their incremental gains against the legal system and thus the destruction of the law itself in favor of their false morality, which they themselves are guilty of violating at a higher level and are seeking to maximize exclusive centralized monopoly control over, facilitating the natural compulsion of the exclusive black market, which, by in fact, is the primary alternative funding to the power of the purse, which the CIA and others have been convinced in order to engage in. And these alternative mechanisms in the black market as profit generate the compulsion of their war on David. Now, in the original estimate, these alternative mechanisms of dark money, such as the ones promoted by Nancy Pelosi, would have actively been funding enemies of the United States, such as the terrorists in the Middle East, which are phantom cells under the control of the KKK, as the white nationalists inside the government have systematically tried to overthrow the United States, such as the Nazis in the FBI, stopped by the military, who then tried their own variation of white nationalist insurrection, as the judge promoted by threat and intimidation says that there is no challenge to substantive power by the SCOTUS or other high court functions, as unitary executive theory is the complete dismantlement or disregard of all American duties and obligations, including all lawful authorities, including the authority to exist as a government, including the authority to not be arrested for the functions of their policies or enforcing any of their objectives. At which point, these exponential fundings and extortions created the war in Ukraine, which also manufactured the move to the green policies in Europe, which actively dismantled their nuclear and gas functions, compelling their subjugation to purchase Russian gas and oil, which facilitates their vulnerability to Russia, which was a predetermined established position in order to screw over David Boal's character. At which point, the war in Ukraine is a proxy war between the white nationalist KKK and the Russians, who strategically have both complied with basically how things are to run. And their settlement on how things are to run just so happens to put Ukraine in the clusterfuck, as was purchased in the black market through the Revenge X program of those who, having failed to acquire the long-term relationship, seek retaliation against David by destroying the projected winners' territories and devastating their peoples, and thus the mass death generated in their projection is basically, it's the same thing as a girl who just found out that they broke up, throwing the clothes out of the window, or breaking the car with a bat or golf clubs or something along these lines. Just generally just ruining everything for the sake of retaliation. That is the entire 100% purpose of the war in Ukraine. It's just a pathetic, small minded bitch engaging in retaliation because of her small minded position and her inferior society, who have the capacity to engage in those retaliations due to strategically placed agents manufacturing the natural results. Now, this was chosen as an alternative strategically on the basis of those funds in the black market actively being used in the War on Terror original estimate by funding the terrorist side by the black market, laundering all of the systems into hyper accelerating it, compelling major battles in order to specifically kill David in the War on Terror, which hyper accelerates the War on Terror so that it would end sooner. At which point, David coming into the military from birth would probably have some kind of call sign like kid, or eventually when they figure out who he is more, the projection says that the prolonged missions that he would have gone on, which would hyper accelerate the overarching conflicts into exponentially shorter times, would require exponentially longer missions on David's part, which would upgrade him into the call sign Odysseus, which manufactures the position of these extraordinarily long for the mission statement, missions, and expenses, at which point the excessively more expensive and excessively more time consuming operations generates much more hectic positions for David, which would equate to more tours than would have otherwise been agreed to, but the overarching war would exponentially have accelerated to a lower end, at which point there is no actual telling on how quickly or how long it would last, except for the engagement of the hyperinvestment into primary battles, which would generate higher casualty, higher damage, higher equipment, higher investment battles for more extreme positions from higher developments from the security protocols, at which point their specific intention to destroy David as a mirror to the war on David in this version would have compelled these hyper conflicts on the basis of strategic agreements with the adversary over which resources would actively be fought over, compelling as an acknowledgement of the mirroring system generates the acknowledgement that because the war on David in this version has systematic distractions, such as the position of James Comey saying that David has to engage in the super veto from his office as a justification of targeting him, which logistically says that they would have to have targeted James Comey's system instead, which was systematically ignored because it has nothing to do with acquiring those strategic objectives so much as it is making the larger trades in the systematic collapse of the entire system in global systems into the insurrectionist one world Satanist structure. At which points I've received copies of specific strategies which assume that the major storm in 2004 around the Horn of Africa would have actively been leveraged in the conflict in order to primarily destroy the majority of the navy of the terrorists, which would not have been able to have defeated David under the presumption of the high defensive techniques actively invested into, actively preventing them from gaining any advantage, systematically advancing the missions in the conflicts as they would lose primary objectives by their aggression on their aggressive tactics towards the assaults, which is the primary objective, which is simply just the destruction of the primary Navy equipment, which systematically being deflected would be highly expensive in its defenses, but majority of the subversions would be effective against them, as they would systematically lose in smaller conflicts and gain ground in larger conflicts, compelling the retreat of the primarily defensive technologies, generating a cat and mouse structure around the seas, which generates the system of their conflict, as David being able to reproduce his defensive techniques faster than they could reproduce their aggressions, the active attacks and rearming and defenses and rearming is less costly for David on the basis of his equipment's strategic arrangements towards refueling the defensive function, as it doesn't need to arm a warhead in order to counter missiles and this type of thing, generating the more effective defense versus the least effective aggression, at which point the less they rush David, the more they take damage, and the more they rush David, the more they strategically have to uh, go around for undesirable expenses in order to acquire the rearming of their systems, which generates their systematic overarching loss as they are becoming exhausted by virtue of actively conducting their malicious attacks in these larger conflicts, at which point the defenses at the higher level are less capable of retaliation outside of a few picking off strategies, which is more effective in the lower conflicts, as they're more cautious they are, the more strategic advantage they have for the positioning, but the trade-off is systematically something that they would not be able to get a foothold into any substantive success.